Good day. As we all know, on Thursday, 30th December 2021, on the eve of the New Year holiday in both the United States and Russia, President Biden of the United States and President Putin of Russia had their telephone call, or, as we shall find out in a moment, possibly more than one call. Anyway, not to jump ahead, both sides have now produced readouts of the conversation, and we've also had briefings from various from the officials, senior officials of both governments. In the case of the United States, it is the senior White House official, the senior administration official. We're not told who he is or who she is, but I suspect, and I think most people believe, that it is Jake Sullivan. And in the case of Russia, it is Putin's foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov. Now, I'm going to say that the Biden White House has made one innovation, which I generally find rather helpful, which is that in advance and subsequent to high-level talks between the US president and a foreign leader, the administration now provides a detailed briefing to the media of the kind of things that were discussed, passing, if you like, the readout of the call, the official readout of the call produced by the administration, which is often not especially informative. And I generally do find that this practice of producing readouts, or rather briefings, supplementing the readouts, quite helpful. And this is indeed what took place on this occasion. I have to say, however, that on this occasion, the briefing was actually extremely uninformative. I've provided a link to the briefing under this video. You can find a link there, but I don't find that there's very much in the actual briefing, the transcript of the briefing that the senior administration official provided to the media in the White House. I don't find that there's actually very much that goes beyond what the rather terse readout published by the White House says. So let's first of all turn to that White House readout, which is produced, or so we're told, by Jen Psaki. It's in the form of a statement by Jen Psaki, the president's spokesperson, but as I said, it's clearly intended to be a readout of the call, and it's fairly short, and I'm going to read it. And it says this: President Joseph R. Biden Jr. spoke today with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. President Biden urged Russia to de-escalate tensions with Ukraine. He made clear that the United States and its allies and partners will respond decisively if Russia further invades Ukraine. President Biden also expressed support for diplomacy starting early next year with a bilateral strategic stability dialogue at NATO through the NATO-Russia Council and at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. President Biden reiterated that substantive progress in these dialogues can only occur in an environment of de-escalation rather than escalation. Now, it's not, as always, a particularly informative readout, and as I said, on this occasion, the briefing by the senior administration official, who's probably Jake Sullivan, wasn't especially informative either. But there are 2 points about this which stand out. Firstly, note the constant repetition of the urging to Russia by Biden, the urging by Biden to Putin for Russia to de-escalate tensions with Ukraine. The second sentence of the readout reads, President Biden urged Russia to de-escalate tensions with Ukraine. And then the very last sentence reads, President Biden reiterated that substantive progress in these dialogues can occur only in an environment of de-escalation rather than escalation. So in two places in this readout, you get a request from Biden to Putin to de-escalate tensions with Ukraine. Now, I have to say that to me, that looks almost like a plea. It comes across almost like Biden, the administration, the United States, pleading with the Russians to lower the atmosphere of tension in Europe. And the US telling the Russians, yes, of course, we understand your concerns. We're worried about your concerns. We express support for diplomacy. We're prepared to have all these meetings, but please take away this gun you're pointing at our heads. It makes it extremely difficult for us to negotiate with you whilst you have that gun pointing at our head in the way that you do. And if the conversation, the tone of the conversation between Biden and Putin was similar to the impression given by this readout, I can't fail but think that the Russians will see all in this a sign of weakness. They will conclude that the whole purpose of the United States engaging with them is to try to persuade them to de-escalate, or at least to lower tensions with Ukraine, lower the temperature with Ukraine. And the Russians might go away and say to themselves, well, given that the Americans are only talking to us because the situation is as tense as it is, our best policy is to keep the situation tense, because if we don't, the Americans will relax and will go away and will say to themselves, well, we don't need to talk to the Russians substantively anymore. So I suspect that these pleas for de-escalation, which are coming from the Americans, are actually going to achieve the opposite effect to the one which is intended. I think it will persuade the Russians that the Americans are feeling the heat and that the Russians should keep the pressure on. Now, if you take your mind back a couple of weeks to Putin's conversation to the Collegium of the Russian Foreign Ministry, the place where he first floated, or at least publicly announced, his intention, Russia's intention, of seeking legally binding security guarantees from the Americans, you will recall that over the course of that conversation, Putin actually spoke of the need for Russia to maintain an atmosphere of tension in order to extract concessions from the United States. This readout, and if that readout, as I said, if this readout is a reflection of the actual tone of this conversation, this readout will have told the Russians that that strategy of tension is working. Anyway, there is one other thing to say about this readout, and that is, notice how complicated the structure of the talks is. We learn that there's first going to be a bilateral meeting between the Russians and the Americans within the format of the Strategic Stability Dialogue that was launched immediately after Putin and Biden met in Geneva in June. Then there is to be a meeting at the NATO-Russia Council meeting. At that meeting, it will not the US's NATO allies, its European allies will be in attendance. And then there's to be a third meeting, a meeting with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Why this incredibly complicated structure? Why have 3 meetings? Well, here we do have to go back to the background briefing paper the transcript of the background briefing provided by the unnamed senior administration official, who, as I said, is probably Jake Sullivan. And you'll find in this briefing that there is this rather interesting, the transcript of this briefing, you find this rather interesting paragraph. President Biden was very clear that the United States will be operating on the principle of nothing about you without you. No conversations about issues that are of ultimate concern to our partners and allies without the full consultation and participation of our partners and allies, which President Putin said that he understood. So the reason we have this elaborate structure of meetings is that it's quite obvious that the Russians have categorically refused any idea of the Europeans, the NATO allies, participating in the negotiations. They are insisting on bilateral negotiations with the United States. The US feeling the heat, as I said, or the pressure, because of the tense atmosphere around Ukraine. The Americans have been obliged to agree to this, but of course they have to fulfill this promise which they've given to their allies and partners that they're not going to negotiate over their heads. So, though they are in fact going to negotiate over their heads, that's what the bilateral meeting between Russia and the United States actually is. We have these follow-up meetings, the one with NATO, and then the other one of the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, which is, of course, the one in which Ukraine, which is not a member of NATO, will formally participate. Now, I'm going to say straight away that if I were the Europeans and if I were Ukraine, I would be absolutely incandescent. I would be furious about this arrangement. Because even though the United States is formally saying that it's not going to negotiate with the Russians over the heads of the Europeans and Ukrainians, that in practice is exactly what it is doing. Firstly, on the 10th of January, by the way, we have all these dates from the Russians. Note that the American readout doesn't provide them. On the 10th of January, there will be the bilateral meeting between the Russians and the Americans, the two great powers. There they will conduct the real substantive discussions. And we don't know how long that meeting will be, but it's likely to be more than one day. And note that there is an interval of 2 days between that meeting and the follow-up meeting, which will be on the 12th of January, between the US and Russia, with the NATO allies also participating in the format of the NATO-Russia Council. So we could conceivably have 2 full days of talks between the Russians and the Americans. And we know, as I said, from the Russians, that the militaries of both sides, at least definitely at the Russian side, surely of the American side too, they will be participating at that meeting on the 10th of January, the important meeting, the one between the United States and Russia. And then, after all the really important things have been talked about by the two big boys, the great powers, well then of course we have a follow-up meeting, and this is a meeting with the NATO allies. And at this meeting, the NATO allies are just going to be told all over again what the two great powers have been talking about and what preliminary agreements they've reached between themselves. And of course, at that point, some of the NATO countries no doubt will have their opportunity to weigh in. No doubt some of them will. I can imagine the Baltic states and Germany, for example, probably Britain too, having various things they might want to say. But of course, the fact is that by that point, the really important discussions, the discussions between the Americans and the Russians, will already have happened. But then consider Ukraine's position, because Ukraine will not be participating in that discussion on the 12th of January. Ukraine will be called in on the next day, the 13th of January, when the meeting then goes into an entirely different format, that of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, so that the Ukrainians can themselves be informed, basically, of what has been discussed without them directly involved. So the Ukrainians are actually being tacked on at the end of a whole line of discussions. First, the real discussions, as I said, between the big boys, the two strong great powers, the Americans and the Russians. Then the pro forma meeting 2 days later with the Europeans, and then the day after that meeting, the awkward child, if you like, called into the room where the adults have all been talking to hear what the adults have been saying about it. I have to say, if I was the Ukrainians, I would feel deeply humiliated by this arrangement. It's, as I said, been constructed in order to create the impression that the Americans are, as I said, operating on the principle of nothing about you without you, as the senior administration official has told us. But in reality, it actually, as far as I'm concerned, conveys the opposite impression. It's, I would have thought, incredibly humiliating for the Ukrainians especially to be treated in this way. Anyway, that's what we get from the American readout and from this briefing paper with a senior administration official. You can read all of these things for yourself. I've provided links, and of course you can form your own view. But of course the Russians have provided their own readout of the conversation, and of course there's also been briefings by Putin's foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov. Notice that in this case there's no hiding his identity. There's no attempt to make him appear anonymous. Yuri Ushakov is quite openly talking to the Russian media, discussing what happened. And in fact, he's a lot more informative, as we're going to see, than the senior administration official is being. But let's first of all go to the Russian readout. And it starts, the title of this readout is immediately interesting. It reads as follows: telephone conversations, plural, with US President Joseph Biden. That's the title. Telephone conversations. As I said, that suggests that there was more than one. Now, that is extremely interesting. I should say the rest of the readout makes it look as if there was only one conversation. But it does beg the question, is this a typo? Was this a typographical error? Or was there more than one telephone call? Now, I'm going to say straight away, the Kremlin is incredibly careful in publication of its readouts. And I rather suspect that if this was a typo, it would have been picked up. So most probably, my guess is that what happened was that there was in fact more than one call. Now, we're told that this conversation between Biden and Putin lasted for 50 minutes. It seems to me that one of them, with no idea which one, made some point to the other, and at that point the other interrupted the call, went away to have a discussion with his advisors and officials, following which the call resumed. That seems to me a plausible reconstruction of what happened. Nothing unusual in that, but of course, if that is indeed what took place, then it's obviously not just a call, not just a conversation, but, if you like, a negotiation, a discussion between the two leaders, a negotiation preparing the ground for the negotiations which are going to take place in January. Now, that would be interesting fact in itself. I don't want to speculate about this too far. It could have been a typo. I'm not sure what the Americans would say about this. I'm not sure what the Russians are saying about this, but that is in the English language version of the readout that the Kremlin has published. And as I said, I know that the Kremlin is very careful on the precise wording of the readouts, and I don't think this was a typo. I think the fact that it appears in the English language version is intended to hint at the fact, as I said, that there was more than one call and therefore some sort of negotiation was taking place. I'm not going to press the point. As I said, ultimately, I just don't know. Anyway, to continue with the readout, on December 30th, Vladimir Putin had a telephone conversation, this time it's singular, with President of the United States of America, Joseph Biden. The conversation focused on the implementation of the agreement to launch negotiations on providing Russia with legally binding security guarantees reached during the December 7th video conference to launch negotiations on providing Russia with legally binding security guarantees. That sentence is every bit as clunky as it sounds. It's actually what I've just done is I've read what's actually written. And the point to make here is that this sentence harps on the words negotiations on providing Russia with legally binding security guarantees. What the sentence tells us is that Putin told Biden at their virtual summit meeting on the 7th of December that Russia wants legally binding security guarantees. Biden agreed to negotiations, and the Russians are making it absolutely clear that so far as they are concerned, his agreement, Biden's agreement to have negotiations is an agreement to negotiate with the Russians legally binding security guarantees. It's almost as if the Russians are saying that Biden has, in effect, agreed that Russia should be given legally binding security guarantees. Now, I suspect that's not quite the American view. I'm sure that the Americans will not say that. And in fact, if we go back to that senior administration official, you will see that he says that many of the things that the Russians are demanding are impossible for the United States to concede. So I doubt that, in fact, Biden did agree to negotiate about legally binding security guarantees for Russia. But this clunky sentence shows the very hardball diplomacy that the Russians are now engaging in. The mere fact of agreeing to sit down and talk to them is being interpreted by them as an agreement to sit down and talk to them about legally binding security guarantees. So that's a very hardball strategy in negotiations. Lawyers, by the way, engage in it all the time. It's unusual for the Russians to act in this way. I've not seen them do it since the end of the Cold War, but they're doing it now. Anyway, to continue with the readout, Vladimir Putin detailed the fundamental approaches underlying the Russian drafts of the treaty between the Russian Federation and the United States of America, and the agreement between the Russian Federation and the member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He stressed that the negotiations needed to produce solid, legally binding guarantees, ruling out NATO's eastward expansion and the deployment of weapons that threaten Russia in the immediate vicinity of its borders. Vladimir Putin further emphasized that the security of any nation cannot be ensured unless the principle of indivisible security is strictly observed. Now, that is the Russians, Putin, taking again an exceptionally hard line. He's saying that well, we're not necessarily going to insist on every single letter and punctuation mark of the draft treaty and the draft agreement that we sent you a few weeks ago being, agreed. But ultimately, what we want is something that is in essence exactly like that, and which is legally binding as well. And as far as we are concerned, that is the purpose of the negotiations. The purpose of the negotiations is not to discuss Ukraine. It is to discuss our own security, the fact that we feel threatened by what NATO has been doing, the fact that NATO must now acknowledge and understand our red lines, that it must not commit to further eastward expansion, and that it must start to pull back its military forces from areas close to our borders. So what Putin is doing is he's taking an extremely strong line. He says, yes, we're prepared to negotiate wording, we are prepared to work on the margins, but the substance of what we want, the essence of our demands, that is non-negotiable. That is a demand. It's not up for some compromise. We're not going to compromise on what we consider fundamental to our own security. Again, Russians being very uncompromising, playing very tough hardball. Then we go on to the next section. Both leaders express willingness to engage in a serious and substantive dialogue on these issues. Well, that is true. The Americans have confirmed it. The most fascinating fact about this Russian demand for legally binding security guarantees and for the draft treaty that they have presented to the Americans and the draft agreement that they have also presented to the Americans. Pointedly, they have not sent it to NATO, which also, however, is supposed to cover NATO. The point about the American response to these Russian demands, and they are demands, is that the Americans, instead of rejecting them outright, saying these are outrageous and unacceptable, the sort of things that people like Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative, and Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, are saying, and what they want the US to do, instead of the US doing those things, they have agreed to sit down and talk, to engage with the Russians in that serious and substantive dialogue. And the reason they're doing that, to come back to my earlier point, is because they are under pressure. They're feeling the pressure. They are conscious of the tension in Eastern Europe. They're worried about the fact that the situation is becoming increasingly tense. They're begging the Russians, almost pleading with the Russians to de-escalate. The Russians are obviously in no mood at the moment to do any such thing. Instead, they're playing hardball. And then we get to the next point. It was confirmed that the negotiations would take place first in Geneva. I suspected it was Geneva, by the way, and now we see it's confirmed. Would take place first in Geneva on January 9th and 10th. So there we go. It's a 2-day meeting. So there'll be 2 days of discussions between the Americans and the Russians. Perhaps it will go on longer because we then learn that they will then as part of the Russia-NATO Council in Brussels on January 12th, bear in mind that leaves room for the discussions to go on beyond the 12th, if there's any need to. So 2 days at least between the Americans and the Russians, perhaps longer, and then NATO, the European allies, are going to be brought in for a meeting in Brussels on the 12th of January. Russians will be there, Americans will be there. The Russians and the Americans will tell the Europeans, the NATO powers, formally what they've been discussing. And of course, the NATO powers, the Europeans, will be given an opportunity to have their say. And of course, the Russians and the Americans will pretend to listen. And then the readout then goes on to say negotiations are also to be held at the OSCE on January 13th. These are the negotiations which are going to involve Ukraine. And note the word also. Negotiations are also to be held at the OSCE on January 13th. It's almost as if these negotiations with Ukraine coming along, being brought in at the very end of the queue, the Russians are almost implying in this readout that that's almost an afterthought. Well, Biden says, we've got to have the Ukrainians involved. And Putin says, okay, I understand. Let's have the Ukrainians involved. Where are we going to put them? Well, we're going to put them at the end of the queue. And it's going to be a negotiation which will also be held, which in effect tells us that they're not going to be real negotiations, because the substantive part of the negotiations is the one that's going to happen in Geneva on January 9th to 10th, and perhaps longer over those 2 days. And of course, there'll also be a proper at least a consultation of some sort with the NATO allies on the 12th of January. And after that, the Ukrainians on the 13th of January, within the umbrella of the OSCE, are going to be told what the adults have decided about them. As I said, deeply humiliating for Ukraine. And by inserting that word also, and I repeat again, Russian readouts, including in English, are extremely precisely worded. The Russians, in effect, are twisting the knife. Anyway, to continue, the president's agreed to personally supervise these negotiating tracks, especially bilateral, with a focus on reaching results quickly. So, a couple of things here. Firstly, they're going to work towards reaching results quickly. Now, a lot of people have been talking a lot about this, and they've been saying that the Russians have some sort of timetable, and that this is all that the Russians expect everything to be racked up and agreed by the end of January. And if it doesn't happen, they're going to invade Ukraine at the end of January, beginning of February, when the ground hardens in midwinter. I've never seen the Russians in any place suggest any such thing. The Russians have said that they do have a time frame and that they do want to see results quickly. They do want something, but they've never said that they expect it all to be agreed in January. And I don't think that the Russian timeframes or ultimatums, if you like, are anything like as hard as that. I think if the Russians were negotiating in that kind of way, they would be taking a much stronger line publicly, even than the one they are doing. And if they were operating to that kind of timetable, the nature of ultimatums like that is that it would be made public, and we would indisputably know. What the Russians are saying is not, I think, that they expect everything, the whole treaty, the whole new architecture to be agreed fully in January. But they do want results, and they do want to see some kind of substantive progress on achieving their objectives this winter. And in my previous video, I floated the kind of objectives which I think the Russians would want to see. They would want to see some kind of commitment from the Western powers that the Minsk agreement, the actual Minsk agreement, should actually be implemented this time, with Ukraine entering into direct negotiations with the leaders of the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics. I think what has led to this crisis this winter is precisely the fact that Ukraine has not only been refusing to implement its commitments under the Minsk agreement, but that the European powers, Germany and France, have been trying to side with Ukraine in order to try to replace that Ukrainian commitment of direct negotiations with Lugansk and Donetsk with negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, something that the Russians consider completely unacceptable, and which has led the Russians to feel that the Europeans are acting in total bad faith. And that's, I think, what has led to this crisis. So if there is a recommitment this time by the United States to the Minsk agreement as originally agreed, with a further commitment from the Western powers that they will work to ensure that Ukraine does negotiate directly with the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics, as it is legally committed to do and as it has committed itself to do, then that will, I think, satisfy the Russians. It will diffuse a lot of the tensions that we are seeing. It will be results, they're not, I think, all the results, quick results that the Russians are looking for. And at that point, we will see tensions ease, and we will see perhaps further negotiations going forward in a calmer atmosphere. I would add that another thing, as I said, that the Russians are in fact going to insist upon is that there should be no move to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO over the next few years. And the United States has in effect, though not in word, but in fact, conceded that already. They've already said, as I've said previously, that they're not going to fight Russia over Ukraine, which in effect means that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. So probably the Russians would like that to be crystallized into a more specific commitment. But obviously, and Putin has made it very clear in this readout, in this conversation he had with Biden, that's only a step towards a full negotiation of a treaty to recreate Europe's security architecture. And everybody must know, the Russians as well as the Americans, that that's going to take many years to agree, if it is ever agreed. The other point to make about this particular sentence, and it's an important one, is that we learned that the presidents agreed to personally supervise these negotiating tracks, especially bilateral. So I've just been explaining that the real negotiation is the one that's going to be taking place directly between the Americans and the Russians, the negotiation that's going to happen on the 9th and 10th of January, and which might go on beyond that. And this sentence confirms it, because that is the negotiation that the presidents, Biden and Putin, are going to personally supervise. They're not going to give as much attention to the discussions in the NATO-Russia Council and in the OSCE. Why are they not? Because those negotiations, those discussions are pro forma. The real negotiations are the bilateral ones between the Russians and the Americans. So that's those words, especially the bilateral, the words especially bilateral, they give the game away. Now, in my previous video, I said that the United States looks like it might be on the verge of making some kind of concessions to the Russians in order to get the negotiations moving forward. And we now see the next paragraph, the Russians alluding to what looks like an important concession. And it says the following: in this context, Joseph Biden emphasized that Russia and the US shared a special responsibility for ensuring stability in Europe and the whole world, and that Washington had no intention of deploying offensive strike weapons in Ukraine. Now, the Americans have denied that Biden made any commitment to Putin not to deploy offensive strike weapons in Ukraine. This has been said on the margins of the various briefings that have been taking place in Washington following this call. But the Russians in this readout are not saying that Biden made a commitment that the United States would not deploy offensive strike weapons in Ukraine. What it says is that Biden said that the United States has no intention of deploying offensive strike weapons in Ukraine. What sort of weapons are we talking about? Well, Putin has been talking about hypersonic missiles. Of course, the United States doesn't have hypersonic missiles. The tests to develop these missiles are apparently taking a very long time, and it may be some years before they're ready, so who knows. And I have to say, I've always thought the idea of the US deploying hypersonic missiles in Ukraine is a bit alarmist, even though the Russians have been playing up that possibility. But we come back to the words offensive strike weapons. What does that mean? Well, it could mean many things. It doesn't just mean hypersonic missiles. I mean, that's a generic word about weapons. It means, presumably, any weapons that could be used in an offensive strike capacity. Now, that could include tanks. It could include fighter jets and bombers. It could include drones. It could include long-range artillery. It could include helicopter gunships. It could include infantry fighting vehicles and such things. Now, I'm not sure whether it covers any of those things, but I think it is highly likely that it does. I suspect that what's actually happened is that there's been a negotiation. There's a negotiation underway. The Russians have made it very clear, obviously, that they don't want to see missiles of any kind, long-range missiles that could be launched against Russia, being deployed in Ukraine. The Americans have said, and Biden undoubtedly repeated over the course of this call, well, of course, we've got no intention, no question of doing that. That's not on our agenda at all. And the Russians are reporting this, making it seem as if Biden has said that the United States is not going to deploy missiles, including hypersonic missiles of that nature, to Ukraine at all. That's a red line anyway for Russia. But the use of the word offensive strike weapons, maybe the envelope of the meaning of that word, of those words, can be extended to include the sort of weapon systems that Ukraine might use if it were to decide to carry out an offensive, a military offensive, against the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics in eastern Ukraine. So I suspect the Russians will say that that is what it means. Maybe the Americans in private agree, but it does look to me as if it means no tanks, no fighter jets, no strike aircraft, no self-propelled artillery, no IFVs, no APCs, no drones, nothing of that nature. And that, in practice, in fact, is an important concession. Not, as I said, a legally binding one, but a step towards a negotiation, an attempt to de-escalate the situation in Ukraine and over Europe. And then we come to the next part of the discussion, and I think this is actually, in some ways, probably what triggered this whole conversation. And this is what the Russian readout says here. Putin gave an exhaustive response to the mention once again by Joseph Biden of the possibility of imposing large-scale sanctions in the event of an escalation of the situation around Ukraine. He suggested that this would be a grave error, de facto fraught with the danger of a complete breakdown in Russia-US relations. Now, there's been much speculation about why the Russians sought this call. Now, it seems to me that it had two purposes. One is to agree the format of these negotiations. This meeting on the 9th and 10th of July, the important one, the bilateral negotiation, the key negotiation between the Americans and the Russians. The second, obviously, the timing of the Russia Council meeting. Well, that's already been agreed some time ago, on the 12th of January in Brussels. And of course, what was new and what clearly emerged out of this telephone call was this meeting, this OSCE meeting on the 13th of January, where Ukraine will be allowed to enter the room where the adults have been talking about it. So that undoubtedly was part of the purpose of this this discussion, of this conversation between Putin and Biden. But I suspect that beyond it, it was an opportunity for the Russians to restate their views on the sanctions issue. Now, note that throughout the entire discussion, throughout the entire readout, Putin has been taking an uncompromising line. He's been telling the Americans, he's been telling Biden, look, I know all about these threats of sanctions. Don't dare to think that I'm in the least bit intimidated by that Russia is in the least bit intimidated about that. This is a matter of our national security. We are not going to be intimidated by your threats of sanctions. We are going to take the necessary steps to ensure and safeguard our security, and we're not going to be deterred by any warnings of sanctions that you might be making. But it certainly goes beyond that, because the important words here are firstly that Putin gave an exhaustive response to the mention once again by Joseph Biden of the possibility of imposing large-scale sanctions. In other words, Putin went into great detail about this issue, and then as part of it he went on to warn that this would be a grave error fraught with the danger of a complete breakdown in Russia-US relations. Now, I have to say that this sounds to me not just as Putin telling the Americans, we're not going to be deterred from what we feel we have to do because of your threats of sanctions. It seems to me that this is a warning, or if you prefer, even a threat. It's telling the Americans, if you go down this route, if you start waging a sanctions war against us, we're not Iran, we're not North Korea, we're not Cuba, we're going to retaliate. And we're going to retaliate in a way that is going to be extremely difficult for you. And when Putin, we're told, went over this in an exhaustive way, I suspect that he spelled out some of the things, though almost certainly not all of them, that the Russians might be minded to do. And when he talks about the danger of a complete breakdown in Russia-US relations, well, the literal meaning of that is a ending of diplomatic relations. In other words, a recall of Russia's ambassador from Washington, and perhaps the closure of the US embassy in Washington, something which, of course, the US would certainly not want to see. But I suspect it goes well beyond that. Now, there are lots of things that we can discuss and speculate about what the Russians might do in retaliation to those kind of threats. I'm going to discuss this in a further video. I think the Russians feel that the threats of sanctions that the Americans are making against them are anyway something of a bluff. We've had a whole string of comments from Russian officials, including the Russian finance minister, Anton Siluanov, which suggests that if there were sanctions, that Russia would ride them out. Sergei Lavrov has said the same thing. But the important point is that this time, the Russians are saying, we're not just going to act passively. We're not going to just sit back and let you sanction us. If you go down this road of imposing further sanctions upon us, we will start to do things in retaliation, in return. And as I said, I'm not going to speculate what those things are, but for what it's worth, I think the Russians do actually have some pretty strong cards they could play. This is a topic that I'm going to discuss in a program I'm going to do about the whole sanctions issue shortly. And then we hear that the presidents exchanged New Year greetings and best wishes. So, despite, all these threats and counter threats, they're actually the best of friends. And, they may be negotiating each other, things may be tense, there may be a possibility of war in Europe, but, they maintain these courtesies with each other. By the way, I think in this, they're both showing their professionalism. Whatever one may think of Biden, he's been around a long time. He was for a while, I believe, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He does, I think, understand the importance of courtesy and politeness in engaging in conversations, diplomatic conversations. The Russians, by the way, in what I take to be a reference to Victoria Nuland, have been saying that other American diplomats are not as careful in their choice of words, and the Russians have been complaining about cowboy language from some of them. I'm pretty sure that is Victoria Nuland that they have in mind. And then we learn that the conversation took place in a frank and businesslike atmosphere, certainly of benefit to both parties. The leaders agreed to continue regular contacts at the highest level. So the negotiation is still underway. It was frank and businesslike. In other words, there was little actual warmth, but they did exchange their views and express them clearly and understood each other better. And it was a benefit to both parties, especially, I suspect, from the Russian point of view, because they spelled out their feelings and their views to the Americans, and the Americans will have gone away and perhaps understood them better. And the negotiations will continue, and they will continue at the highest level. And alongside this, as I said, this readout, we've had a whole set of briefings by other senior Russian officials. We've had the Russian ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, and he has said in an article published in Foreign Policy magazine on Thursday, this is published in conjunction with the telephone call between Biden and Putin. He says that no one should doubt our determination to defend our security. Everything has its limits. If our partners keep constructing military strategic realities imperiling the existence of our country, we will be forced to create similar vulnerabilities for them. So what exactly that means, I'm not quite sure, but it sort of hints at something being done which will put the United States in a militarily precarious position, the same kind of militarily precarious position that Russia would be in if the United States went on acting in this aggressive way. And then Antonov went on to say, military exploration of Ukraine by NATO member states is an existential threat for Russia. Urgent action is needed. The principle of equal and indivisible security must be restored. This means that no single state has the right to strengthen its security at the expense of others. With political will, this can be achieved through the development of serious long-term and legally binding security guarantees. And then we learn from it that he said that NATO is seeking to make Ukraine and Georgia its members. And he goes on to say, with the crawling of the alliance into Ukraine's territory, the threat to Russia's security is sharply increasing as missile systems with minimum flight times to our country and other destabilizing weapons can be deployed there. So all kinds of tough words from the Russian ambassador to the United States. And then, as I said, we've had briefings from Yuri Ushakov, the foreign policy, Putin's foreign policy aide. And we learned from TASS that US President Biden agreed when Putin said Russia was seeking results in the talks on security guarantees. Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov said on Friday, Putin told Biden about the principles that underlie Russia's security proposals. The president said talks were important, but the key goal for Russia was its security, and the country will seek to achieve that goal. And then Ushakov is reported by TASS as going on to say, the US president has generally agreed with our point of view, and his reaction made sense and was quite serious. So the Russians suggest that Biden seemed to be receptive to Russia's concerns about the situation in Europe and the situation with respect to Ukraine. And then Ushakov went on to say that the key point that was voiced by the American side during the call was that President Biden clearly stated that the US doesn't plan to deploy offensive weapons in Ukraine. So for the Russians, that is the key point. That's Ushakov's words. The key point that was voiced by the American side during the call was that President Biden clearly stated that the US doesn't plan to deploy offensive weapons in Ukraine. Notice that here Ushakov isn't talking about offensive strike weapons. He's not talking about the missiles that the Russians have been talking about, that Antonov has been, the Russian ambassador to Washington, has been talking about. He specifically and uses the word offensive weapons, which appears to me to include the full range of offensive weapons: tanks, helicopter gunships, fighter jets, drones, long-range artillery, and all the rest. So there we are. Negotiations are proceeding. The tensions that the Russians have created in Europe are achieving the results that President Putin said they would at that meeting of the Foreign Ministry Collegium a few weeks ago. The US has apparently told the Russians that they're not going to deploy offensive weapons of any kind in Ukraine, and there's going to be negotiations, substantive negotiations about meeting Russia's security concerns, with probably some movement in that direction over the course of the winter, but with the negotiations clearly intended to go on beyond that, and probably culminating eventually in some kind of general agreement, though not one that will not, I think, take place, not for many years. So there we go. An interesting negotiation. As I said, I reiterate that in my opinion, the primary reason for Putin's call was to make it very clear to the United States, again, that the Russians are extremely serious about what they're demanding, that they are not prepared to negotiate or dilute their key demands, that they're not deterred by the threats of sanctions, and if the US goes down that route of imposing sanctions on Russia, Russia will retaliate, and it has the means to do so. It will retaliate both in economic terms and, as the Russian ambassador Anatoly Antonov has said, they have military technical means of retaliating as well. So there we are, a complex negotiation, a difficult negotiation, but some progress, at least some movement, maybe not progress exactly, but some movement is being made, with the Americans, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, feeling the heat and giving up some ground. Well, thank you again for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me again shortly as I discuss all of these questions. We're almost up to the hour, so I will briefly say you can check us out on Locals. You can check out our main channel, the Duran. You'll find links under this video. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to your shop and you can buy our mugs there. And you can support us by ticking your subscription, by ticking the like button for this video, and by checking your subscription. Thank you for joining me again today, and have a very good day.